And we're back. Hi, everyone. I'm your host, Hans Gutherson, here for another episode of Wedgie Talk, first ever Wedgie Fetish podcast where I talk to some of the coolest creators in the community about their fetish writing and the community in general. I have a very special guest with me here today, a very good friend of mine, someone who's racked up 116 watchers, more than 9,000 page views, and also the winner of the first ever Wedgie Story Playoffs contest, my good friend LF-Shadowmelder. You know him from stories like Perfect Fit, Overture of Rain, and series like Artificial Purgatory, The Rogue, and Memoirs of the Unseen. He's also Rook of Spades' pick for best story in his music contest. So quite the catalog of stories. And I'm very excited to chat with him tonight. Thank you so much for joining me, Shadow.
Well, thank you for having me, Hans.
It's we've been friends for a long time. I think that's no secret. So it's really great I get to have you on. I'd love to, I guess, if I may, sort of start at the very beginning, where I usually do. And I guess the question I like to start with the name LF Shadowmelder. Where did that come from for you?
Well, I want to say it's a more interesting background. Like, I was thinking that, how some authors have some initials of their names, like A.R.R. Tolkien or
Yeah.
any other kind of. But no, it really is just the name Shadowmelder was taken, so I'm actually not. Like, LF is not part of the name. It's just something I added for DeviantArt Shadowmelder. But the name itself, it comes from. It's a term from I guess some might recall from the Warcraft games. Uh, it's a video game. It's just a reference there. And yeah, I mean that's sounded cool. It was available in Lucky Fetish, so I ran with it. It wasn't available like in DeviantArt. So I added LF because I don't have the foresight to see that it might not be the best thing to add to a name.
I like it. It's a good name. And I like Shadow as well, but Shadow Melder I think is always cool and good to know right off the bat you're a hardcore gamer. I think we'll have a chance to dive into some of that as well with Warcraft. But before that, I'd like to again starting at the beginning, if I may, I'd love to ask uh if you can sort of recall how did the fetish start for you?
Well, I think that one started when I watched the. Well, I guess it's a common theme from what I've heard of the podcast. Watching in cartoons or like series like that when I was young. I didn't know back then what it meant or that it was like fetish. It's just something that I found curious or like interesting, and I couldn't explain why until like years later. I would later discover what it meant.
That's well said, and I think definitely a theme, I think, among fetishists, people who like wedgies for sure, to sort of know it without knowing it. So you mentioned years later, sort of realizing what it means. At this point, now you're a very popular writer as well. I'm curious about how that came to be. Why did you first start writing in the community?
Well, for the community, it's I started like I said with Lucky Fetish. I'm trying to recall the year when I started there. I actually made an account there to lurk, and Shadow Melder is has a lurker name as it gets. And eventually, I guess, I got motivated enough by other writers. Like I didn't make much in terms of like they didn't tell me, hey, you should start writing specifically, but they were like in a way encouraging to other people who started writing in the forums. So, I mean, I gave it a shot, and apparently people liked it. So I kept doing it. That's how it started. Specifically, fetish writing. I had written before that.
And what sort of stuff were you writing before that?
Actually, I had been on a break before I started writing fetish, but when I was way younger, I wrote like fiction, I mean, non-fetish fiction, non-erotica, just plain old fantasy and like modern, realistic, quote-unquote fiction. Not really realistic, just in a boring setting. That's what I mean. Not a fantasy setting.
I love it. I think there's a lot for us to touch on later, I think, in terms of some of your influences in your writing. But before we dive into a lot of your specific stories or talking about what you're writing, what you've been writing, I guess, so to speak, I'd love, for those who maybe don't know your work as well as some of your super stalker fans like myself, I'd love to know how would you describe or sum up your writing or your stories?
I mean, like describing the style of the writing itself, or
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
okay.
exactly.
Well, I think um, I'm trying to recall from the written interview you did with me a while back. I don't remember exactly the answer I gave, but it's it's a process that goes like in a way, like a blend of trying to make. I guess I described it before in some. I told someone that that wedges for me are like action scenes in a movie, where I try to make wedges important to the movie or to the plot in this case, and try to make them meaningful. So that's why usually in my stories I don't have as many, but I try to give them weight. Well, that's the attempt. That doesn't mean it always pans out. Oh, and besides that, I try to make a story. I mean, I talk about that first because that's a focus of the podcast, but in writing in general, I just try to make a story. So that means I try to make characters, try to make motivations, interactions, dialogue between them, and all that. And, just make them react in a way to wedgie scenes, if that makes sense there.
Does, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And really great insights for sure into your process. One thing I'm curious about too, I know Max has sort of spoken about this before when he's praised you a lot, but he pointed out the fact that you're a writer for whom English is a second language. And I only bring that up because I'm sort of curious for many of the writers in the community who sort of speak it. Uh, for someone like yourself, it probably brings up different struggles or maybe some difficulties, but maybe also some possibilities in your writing that are different for us. So I'm curious for someone who uh, didn't speak English originally as a second language. What are the sort of struggles of that coming into this community and writing wedgie scenes?
Well, first, I guess people might have just noticed, or through well, I guess just the way I speak. This is like the first public speaking, so to say. Um, so they might have to catch up to the tone. But also, the thing that people might have noticed already through writing is some of the idioms or some of the words, the vocabulary used. Sometimes it mismatches the intended effect. Like the typical would be speaking in a very formal academic sort of jargon when characters are supposed to be peers in a casual setting. That's one. Other is just in general, grammar and spelling. It's gonna depend on really the person. I'm not gonna say everyone's like this, but in general, like if you learn English as a second language, you might struggle a bit. You might have like some, not because you don't know them. It's sometimes you forget because you internally, your analogy is that you're crossing wires. They're processing language in a way and then another one, and sometimes you take something from another language and use it here when you shouldn't. And well, you don't notice it, it's wrong because it makes sense to you at the moment. And, that just means you gotta do more editing.
Well said. And it's a great point you make that if there are issues that you sometimes struggle with, it just comes down to more editing or being careful with it. But from that, we've talked about this before, but I've sort of said being bilingual, you could, in theory, write wedgie stories totally in Spanish and sort of probably write some of the best ones out there, or you could potentially incorporate a lot more Spanish into your stories. Uh, so I'm curious, sort of why is the decision to sort of focus on writing in English or so much in English?
Well, uh, it's a curious thing to think about. But yeah, I guess at this point, it's safe to say, yeah, my original language is Spanish. You just got on there. Um, why not use it? Well, I guess it's context. Like when the fetish started, it was rooted in cartoons and mostly in a lot of it. A lot of I guess it's no surprise, no revelation here that American culture has you know spread throughout the world like nothing. And for me, the context of wedgies is inherently American because it's not something that happened or it did happen, but very rarely in my country or my city at least that I know of. So it's always been English, the international context, as I often think about it. And I guess writing in English as well is more enjoyable, I'd say, at least for me. And you can get to different audience that way.
Sure. Those are all great insights. I appreciate you sort of opening up a lot about that. It makes a lot of sense. So to step back as well, you mentioned writing fantasy as well outside of the community, and your work is it stands out because it really does seem to draw in a lot of different sort of creative angles and tell very different stories from a lot of the stuff we see in the community. So I'm curious to know what some of your influences on your writing are. Who sort of inspired the LF-Shadowmelder that we know and love?
But like off the top of my head, I wouldn't be able to name you a list of top influential authors because I'm not like a very well. I'm not a great reader, and well, a lot of it. I mean, I can name some. Like I guess some are not like no lie, like Tolkien that I already mentioned, and Lovecraft, which features a bit in some of my stories. But in general, my major inspiration is, um, well, video games actually. as as weird as it might sound for writing, but it is. And more specifically for fetish writing, I think the community is an influence. I know some might make the argument that you just gotta read like actual quote unquote real authors and writing, but the truth is, yeah, that can help you a lot. But for fetish writing, you still need to know how to write the fetish itself. And let's just say there's not a lot of published material, or at least not that I found in the local Barnes and Nobles. So,
Well said, Shadow. Great insights from there as well. But you mentioned video games being big for you. You mentioned Warcraft earlier on as well, and I hinted at the fact you're a bit of a gamer. So, what video games would you say influenced your writing?
well, there's a lot of them, but I guess the main influences are, in general, Blizzard games. That includes Warcraft, but also StarCraft, Diablo, and so on. But there are also some other, I guess, games that in general make a great setting, make for great world building are my major influences. So games like the From Software games, that's the ones who made Dark Souls and other games like that. Those are also major influence. And also, and I guess recently, since you mentioned Artificial Purgatory, uh, Amplitude Studios is a recent addition to my catalog of inspiration. Um, and yeah, I mean, it's really sometimes it's just I think of a game and I think of something like that for a story, and that's sometimes how it comes. Even if the story, sometimes it's a direct like fan fiction. I have a couple of those, but in general, even if it's not fan fiction, you can see. You think about games, you'll find the references. They're not well hidden there.
I love that. But it's the passion showing through, I think, which is great. Uh, Before we move on, I'm curious. You mentioned a bit about your process when it comes to coming up with ideas. Sometimes you said it's adapting the concepts or some of the settings from the games, if that's fair to say that way. I'd love to sort of dive in a bit more into your process. What does that look like when you're writing a story?
Well, it all starts for me with the outline, and I know every writer has their own process. For me, the outline keeps me uh, keeps me coherent, makes it a little more logical, even though it might change. It's not a definitive list of here's what needs to happen. It just makes me think of like start planning ahead. I know this might happen, so when I'm writing, I can start thinking of logical causes for said event to happen in a way. And yeah, if you if you think of an event and you think of the characters, it's like a game of just matching for me in a way. Like I know my characters, I know, and sometimes inspiration for characters comes from different sources. But if I know the character and I know what they're gonna be interacting with, either other characters or events, I can sort of piece out what like what they're gonna do in like in consequence of what they just experienced or are gonna experience, and that's how it just keeps going.
I love that. I think that's super fascinating. So stepping away from that, some know this because I'm often talking about how awesome you are, but you're an incredible dungeon master as well as writer and contest winner extraordinaire. And you're the reason I got into D&D in the first place, which is really cool to me, I think. You inspired me to play it, and I'm curious, as a dungeon master, someone who guides the adventure in games for people not familiar with the D&D universe, do you feel like that experience of running games and sort of organizing players in the community or outside of it, or just maybe playing D&D in general, do you think that has had an impact on your writing in any way?
As for directly inspiring writing, a bit, because I well actually the two of us we published just saying for the audience that we published one of the RPs we did together that's
Mm.
based
Yeah.
on a D&D adventure. Actually, this one I didn't run it, but it was inspired by it. And the one I like, the games I run, they do they do serve in a way because it makes you think a lot about world building, which is something I already mentioned. And I know a lot of authors don't really think it's that important. For me, it is. So yeah, as a dungeon master, that's most of the work you're doing. You're setting up the world, setting up the setting, setting up the so-called initial characters, and then you gotta leave it up to the players to decide what's gonna happen and the way they interact with it. Which I guess it might sound familiar to people who RP, who which might have noticed that D&D and RP they have some similarity.
Hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, so if you understand how like RPing sets up for writing in a way. You can kind of see also how in D&D it works the same way.
Very cool. Some really interesting insights in there as well, and I think another reason for everybody to play D&D. Hopefully, you inspired some others to join, as you did me. But beyond that, I'm curious. You mentioned some of the struggles of writing when English is a second language, but I'm curious as well because you've been writing so much recently and have always sort of been writing, it sounds like, in a lot of different ways. I'd love to hear what some of your struggles have been and how you've maybe overcome those in the past when you're writing. Or is it just super easy for you to write? No problems.
No, not at all. And how have I overcome this? Well, it's it's on a case by case basis really. I've had like I'm assuming all writers they all have their own set of struggles, and we might share some of that.
Yeah.
But for me, it's been sometimes they don't. It's not like a sometimes it's not like a ladder where you think like you just overcome this step, go to the next one. Sometimes more like circles. Sometimes they come back to you. Sometimes they're not fully done as one might think. Sometimes they get back. And you know, one of my main problems, one of my main issues is insecurity in general, not feeling like I'm good enough with the writing and that people won't like it. And that's something that's normal. I'd say, I want to say with a lot of writers, but I can't say that for sure. What I can say is that a lot of new writers do have that, and it's logical. You know, you haven't, you don't have anything yet, so you're not sure if people are gonna like it. And how you deal with that? Well, everyone in the community says, you just gotta keep writing and write for yourself. Don't think too much about what others will think about it. And it's hard to say this because again, it's not something I already overcome. I still find this issue every now and then. I just gotta think back to that. That I already went through this, and I just tried it. And you know, there's other things you can do. Like sometimes you can get feedback or comments or critique, and that can help you because people will sometimes tell you this is what's wrong. And you can either say yeah, it is if you think it is and you analyze it, or you can say, no, I think it's not an issue and it's another problem you gotta solve. Just dealing with this um, well, feedback if you have any.
That's well said, yeah. And a struggle, I think, for everybody, both the insecurity and the lack of feedback. I think insecurity, if I may throw out my thoughts, it's something I know I definitely faced, and many other writers in the community do. Like you said, starting out, I think part of it, it's also maybe helpful, no, despite the fact it doesn't seem like that, because it can be pretty paralyzing. But worrying about what people think might in some ways get you inspired to write more and to write better and to make sure you're taking care that your work's really good, to do your best to make sure it's good. But you make an excellent point that sometimes it comes back. But I like your idea of just talking to yourself and thinking that you've been through it and you've dealt with it before. So even if it comes back, that does make it a bit easier. But your writing is clearly loved and has been loved for quite a while. So although that might not help with the insecurity, I hope you know that there are a lot of people, including myself, who really do enjoy the work you've been doing. But
Well, thank you for sharing that.
yeah, of course, like you said, good to get that feedback when we can. So here's my chance to praise you, and you can't stop me because this is my podcast. But jokes aside, jokes aside, I want to say, in addition to being a writer with a growing community, like I said, been definitely seen a lot of people sort of finding you and really loving your work recently. And since you joined, you're also the winner of the first ever Wedgie Story Playoffs, which is huge. You competed for multiple weeks against a lot of different writers, going head to head, and winning it all, which was really incredible. No, we had a whole podcast where we chatted about how that went for on the judge's perspective, but we didn't hear or didn't get any input from the writers on what they thought of it. So before I sort of pick your brain a bit on what you thought about that whole process, I'm just curious, what was it like sort of having to manage all those deadlines? Like you were writing on a really intense schedule, stories coming out like every week. What was that like for you to have to pump out so many stories of such quality?
Well, like you mentioned, it was a new contest, and I guess it's fair to say that it's something that hasn't been done before in this community. And one of the lessons I learned from this is that I will never do it again. It's no, I mean, it's I like the contest, and of course, I mean, I'm not gonna complain about winning. It's just it was a very stressful process for me, and I'm not blaming the judges or the other competitors. It's just I've if you've seen my gallery, you can check the timestamps if you want. If you don't believe me, I don't write that fast. I I take a lot of time, and I know there are writers who can do much faster, and you can always improve your writing speed and practice and all that. But that's not something I was prepared for. Like, I had an idea that, yeah, maybe I'll just have to think of a better way to streamline this. And I guess the judges maybe caught on to that with how I was planning for um, this long story, this long recurring story throughout the whole process. And well, I guess that's better reserved for a more detailed, I guess, postmortem of the contest. And well, yeah, like I mentioned, having this sequential story where it's not just a long story that's divided by chapters in each round. I wanted the story to be this sort of like short stories, but I guess we can talk about that in, if we talk more in detail of the contest itself.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I would love to do with you. As I mentioned, when we judges sort of talked about it, it was from that very uh, the perspective of judges who didn't know what it was like to have to write so much and go head to head with other writers, really just from our own pretty limited perspective of it. So I'd love to get your thoughts on the format. Like you said, it was the first time we ever did something like this. I'd love to just hear what worked for you, what didn't, as a writer and the winner of it. What are your thoughts
Yeah.
overall on the format?
Right, well, I'm gonna be a little critical here, and now it's my
Please.
turn. Now it's my
Yeah,
turn to judge. uh,
you earned
now,
it.
like I mentioned, as I was trying to do this format with different stories, but I didn't like make it strictly just this is the contest story entry, and that's why you noticed that I stopped writing about the series with that doesn't even have a title before, and people just refer to it as Icebreaker, as I've heard.
Yes.
Um, but besides that, I'm speaking more broadly of the contest. If I was the one running the contest, I know the playoff format is exciting because you get this head-to-head um, feeling of well sports, and I know that's the idea Max had behind it. But if it was to me, I wouldn't do playoffs. I think some might agree or disagree on what I'll say, but here are the things I found. It doesn't always get the best writers on the next round. Thanks to the format and thanks to a special case, which probably people already know that there was a mulligan round, which is basically we start over again as if results haven't been gone through.
Mhm.
thanks to that format, I both won when I shouldn't have won, and I lost when I'm not gonna say I shouldn't, but I lost in a way that okay. So I'll explain because it might come off wrong. For example, in my case, first round I was up against RT Blackwood and Steam Writer, which I know is very talented. Didn't submit for the story, and coincidentally, the authors seem to like the judges, sorry, seem to really like Icebreaker. So it's almost like a, so to speak, a shame that their favorite story or their favorite part of the story was an automatic win. It's it seems like pointless in a way, even though I know outside of the contest it's not pointless. Just within the contest, that was a free win. I could have just submitted some finished stuff and won. The other side, there's this talented writer Magnipulse. He one of the judges' favorites and all that, and for good reason. He has very good stories. He actually won, and I think it's not no secret, or maybe it wasn't. I just revealed it. He won second round against me, and if this was a, if you know, if the mulligan hadn't happened, I would have lost, and I wouldn't have progressed beyond second round. And yet I still did after the mulligan. And then we got a rematch, and this time I won, which I guess it's good for me. I'm not gonna lie, but it still sucks, and I don't think it was the best to have a writer win after that in this format. What I would do better instead, um, I would I would just not use playoffs. I think a better format for me would be something like a point-based system, where, well, I guess it's an option point-based. Make grading a bit more strict, and maybe having a more strict scoring, I guess, rubric would be needed for that format. But just just ranking the stories in each round, not having them go head to head, I think would have been something I preferred from a contest. That makes sure the best stories make it the way up, not the best matchups. And I think you already saw that, right? There were some favorite authors or stories that didn't make it that far just because their matchups were that good. And I think that sucks for those who, well, just because of the luck of the draw, I guess didn't make it that far.
That's great. And really, really, really great input there, I think, for myself or Max. If we ever look at a different format, I think that's a really cool alternative. Or for others considering new ways to run contests, I think that's a really
Oh
cool
yeah.
idea to consider. So thank you for that.
Just
Definitely.
to,
Yeah.
I just wanted to add that I'm not advocating that a point-based system is better or that you shouldn't use playoffs. That's just my opinion, and I mean I don't like we all know this is the first time it's been done, so no one knew anything how it was gonna play off, and well, it's how it was, and maybe it is the best. I don't know.
yeah, yeah. No, I appreciate the criticism and your thoughts on that for sure. Like you said, being the first time, things were bound to go kind of haywire, and things would be a little up in the air. But it's great that we can come out of it with really cool feedback and ideas on how to improve or different approaches to it in the future, which I think is very important. So from there, I guess again to sort of pivot a bit, we chatted a bit about your writing, and we threw out some of the names of your stories, and I could go on for so long about all the stories of yours I love, but I'd love to hear from you. Do you have some favorites of your own work that you think people should check out?
Well, I mean it's a long list of stories, but yeah, if I were to recommend some stories, I guess as most people or most authors I've heard, they don't recommend the first stories. And I guess in this case I'll agree just because most of my earlier stories are actually the start of series, and like there are series each of them, and I haven't finished them, so it's gonna be a little bumming to start reading that and just it's incomplete. But disregarding that, what stories would I recommend? Well, let's say if we go by numbers, I think one of the favorites there, and I agree with it, Overture of Rain. I think it's both numbers wise, it's a favorite, and personally, I think I also liked it. I went hard with the theme there, and I recommend it. It's not hard. You don't. It's not hard to get into it. You don't need any knowledge of my previous stories to read. I had to name a second one, and I don't know how many you'll allow me to, but I'll go by three stories. Uh, a second story that I would recommend. I think in this case it would be something like I think Yearn. I'm not sure why Yearn. It's an old story and it has more chapters to it, but I think it's a more casual, I guess, setting wise, theme wise. I think it's a more casual story, but still I think has enough there. And I think that's great. And because I'm thinking again as a beginner, as I haven't read any of Shadowmelder stories, where would I start? That's where I would start, just because they're easier to get into. Uh, a third one, just to ruin the theme I had just established here. Yeah, um, I would go with something like let's see. I think a cold whisper. I think it's out of one of the most popular ones out there. But I think it serves two purposes for a beginner. First, it establishes one of the more darker stories I've written, and also one of the more setting wise. It's more of the more thematic, I guess, in setting sense. It's more hard, I guess, to get into compared to the first two. That's why it's the third one. But it serves the second purpose of being an easy introduction to the broader universe that most of my stories belong into. Yes, I have a common universe and some common characters that cross different series and stories. So I think that one's a good one where you don't need to have read previous entries to understand what's going on because it borrows from some common tropes and still lays down their foundation for you, like see and go, wow, I found this setting interesting, or I found this main character, or well, I guess I could say antagonist interesting. I want to read more of them. Well, there you go. There's more of them. There's a direct sequel and a lot of indirect stories where both setting and characters crossover. So you can check those out if you want. That's why it's the
Nice.
third one.
That's awesome, show. Thank you for that. I'm curious too. Does your broader universe have a name?
So far, I think the working title. I don't have a proper title. It's the Unseen Universe. Just I know it sounds pretentious too, but it's it's just because it's the setting that Memoirs of the Unseen is set on. That's what that I think is where the name comes from, and it's the Unseen Universe. So actually I have a folder in my DeviantArt that's just tagging all of the stories that belong to that same universe. So yeah, Unseen Universe starts with Memoirs of the Unseen, but it goes through many different settings and stories. If You can check those out if you want.
That's great. Thank you for that. Very cool to know. And also, just because you mentioned it, Memoirs of the Unseen, that's the first stories you put out in the community, right? I think, if I
Yes,
remember correctly, the first.
directly
So
from Lucky Fetish. Yeah.
and I think it's really a fascinating place to start. I think a lot of people, when they start writing, myself included, we look to the very familiar, the sort of cheerleaders and nerds in college, and the hot wedgies ensue from there. But you have a very ambitious fantasy series with magic and a lot of different races there. Uh, and we've talked about some of your influences from games like Dark Souls to fantasy in general. But I'm just curious, when comes to starting with Memoirs of the Unseen, was that an idea you had always had for a while, or was there some specific inspiration behind sort of writing that story uh, to begin with?
There is, and I guess in writing in general, fetish stories in general has several inspirations. For Memoirs of the Unseen, the inspiration I think is not that well hidden. If you're familiar with the Dark Souls series, it's right there on the titles of the chapters, and yeah, even from the get-go, kindling there. I think anyone who knows that will immediately catch up to that. But no, beyond that, it's actually not related too much about like Dark Souls in general. It's more of a, I guess the term is urban fantasy. I'm not sure if that's true, but it's set on on a modern day city, and there's some fantasy going on in the background. And yeah, I mean, Dark Souls inspired a bit. It's also inspired a bit by stuff like even Harry Potter and like some kind of just modern fiction, which it's I think what inspired me a bit, just thinking about this this character Haley, which is my first character, and Sophia, which is the second main character there. Um, they just thinking about them it was just thinking about people just hanging out and having a reason to keep hanging out. I guess I know it sounds dumb, but it's how it goes, and that's from where it started. And there was also another inspiration, which is beyond some of the stories. For example, yours truly, that's YWNR. There's also other stories like from Lucky Fetish, that'll be Screen Warriors, Pantyborn, which no surprise given the reference material I'm using. But yeah, it made me really interested in seeing how I could adapt like a fantasy sort of magic and sort of a more occult sort of relationship between characters in Wedgie stories. That's where it went, and yeah, I
That's
think
great.
that's the main things at least.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I guess, like you said, there's so many. Sometimes there's so many inspirations and so many influences in the work, but to know there are some main ones in yours, I think, is really cool. And for fans like myself, we know other stories to look at and other games to play to see to sort of trace that back and see where the inspiration leads to. But one thing I'm curious about too, that's where you start, and you mentioned some of your first characters, which is must be super wild for you after sort of years of writing. I'm curious to know, how would you say your writing has sort of changed over the years, if it has at all?
Right. Well, the from the get-go, the thing readers will notice, I hope, is much less frequent misspelling and grammar errors and stuff like that. But yeah, more seriously, in terms of writing themes and characters and such, I think the main change is just trying to make the writing more meaningful, which is a little vague, which shouldn't be a surprise. That's part of my style, and I should have mentioned that on the question that I like to keep things vague because it helps give the reader something to do in a way besides reading. They're asking questions, and there is such a thing as being too vague and not giving enough information. I know, but I still like to give their some things to think about and make their own interpretations. But yeah, back to the question. Sorry. Uh, when it comes to the changes, I think making writing more meaningful. I've changed a bit on making descriptions, hopefully more impactful and less verbose, having less writing there, but making it more meaningful. Same with dialogue. But again, that's just what I feel and what I'm aiming for. Doesn't mean it actually pans out in all of the stories.
Still really great insights, and I think, as you probably saw recently, your job, or I should say your quest to sort of keep things vague to get readers thinking, definitely hasn't gone unnoticed, right? In the recent awards episode, Max and AP and myself went off talking about the doll and its symbolism in Kindred, and a lot of how it sort of opened up a lot of discussion for us. So it's really cool that to take that sort of approach and see where it goes, I think, in your writing. And something I think helps set you apart, which is really interesting as well. But that's a lot of, we've covered a lot from your writing to winning the contest, and a lot of thoughts you've had on that as well. I'm curious too about any now general thoughts you have on the community, if there's things you wanted to bring up now, or points we haven't touched on about the community, or just questions you want to sort of throw out to the community as we sort of wind down our discussion.
Wow, there's a lot that I want to talk about the community, but to keep it short, it's a great place, I think, for writers. It was very encouraging for me, and I think it's still there. I think a lot of new writers have come out since I started. Some of them doing way better than me, even when they joined much more recently, and others which are just joining and they just wanna share things for others to read, and I like it. I think there's a lot of diversity in the stories and writing, and I know it's easy to sometimes criticize some of the stories because they are either, I don't know, too too focused on the fetish and just making wedgies happen, which is it's a taste. And there are other stories which are all the opposite. There are just stories with some people describe as having some wedgie just placed there because it has to have one. It just filling a checklist. There's anything all in that spectrum. That's what I found. And there's a lot of writers. I don't know if you allow me to make some shout outs, but there's a lot of
Sure, please do. Yeah.
right. I mean, I already mentioned some authors here in this podcast, so I won't mention them again just to keep it a little more, give more variety. But others, even um, like um, Two Worlds by Anime Panties, one great inspiration there as well. But a lot of authors have been, some still active, some not so much. But you know, authors like JCCW, Sinderna, um, Critical Sinogre. I don't know what's the pronunciation on that one.
Yeah.
But the Enigmatic Systematic, Rook of Spades. I don't want to just make. I'm just going through a list, but I know there's a lot more, many more. I've read stories. I always try to comment when I read a story. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I don't even favorite. Sometimes I don't read it at all. And I'm sorry, I just have a lot of stories here I do want to read. So if it just looks like, hey, this guy doesn't read anything about me, or why he didn't call me out, but no, I there's a lot of great stuff there. I just I'm not a great reader. I already said that. I have a lot to catch up to.
Still, that's beautifully said, Shadow. Thank you for that. I think from your thoughts on the community, I love that you see it as such a great place for writers with such diversity, and I think it definitely can be that. I think it's certainly not without its problems, as
Oh,
we both
definitely.
know for sure. But that goes without saying, I think. But it's great to get to hear how good it can be. So I really appreciate that, and all your shout outs. It's a lot of great people, but I'm sure they'll all appreciate that. As you said, sometimes feedback can be few and far between. So shout outs like that always go a long way, I think, which is great. I think that covers off my big questions. I appreciate you taking so much time to chat with me. I'd love to, if I may, sort of ask what the future holds for LF-Shadowmelder. Do you have any future plans you can share with us? Anything you're considering? Or even just sort of dreams, things you think might be cool for you to try out or maybe experiment with in the future?
Well, there's something I can share, and you probably already know what I'm referring. Is I'm working on my first commission ever, and I just want to disclose I'm not sure if I'm gonna be opening that. If people care about doing commissions, I'm not sure if I'll open that soon. But I'm doing one right now for yours truly, your host of this podcast. Which so you should support this guy so he can keep doing commissions for me. just kidding.
I'll be your whale, I guess, as the video game industry would say. I'll just
Oh
keep
yeah.
commissioning you constantly. Yeah, all right, if you insist. Uh, but it's a cool step for sure, getting into commissions. Like you said, early days, so maybe you don't know if you'll open it permanently, but it's exciting that you're sort of taking that step, it sounds like. Is there anything else beyond that? Things you're maybe thinking about, or stories that you're thinking about, or maybe continuations of your existing ones? Really, just anything we can maybe that you're maybe hoping to maybe tackle one day, or future things you think might be cool.
Oh, so many projects. I call them projects, by the way.
Yeah.
But I'm meaning stories in this, or chapters of existing stories. Oh, there's a lot of them I want to continue. I want to continue all like the Rogue. I want to continue memoirs. I want to continue Artificial Purgatory. I want to make new short stories. It's just there's a lot of. I mean, and I'm not a great writing. A lot of like the contest I already mentioned. It was very stressful having to write so frequently. But I'll try. I'll try to get more stories if people like them, and it seems they do. So I'll just keep doing them.
Nice. So we got that to look forward to. It sounds like your fan base and me, your super big, super number one fan. Always great to hear more stories are coming, which is awesome. Is there anything we didn't talk about in terms of your work, the community, sort of what's next for you that you want to end us off on?
Well, so besides commissions and what I'm gonna continue, I don't think so. Maybe no, I can't think of anything else. Well, maybe besides you know, this is the first, like say, public this you know podcast I've been on. This was a great opportunity for me. This was super awesome, and I don't know if if I can say this, but you've been wanting to have me since the start. So
Yes.
it was a giant step for me having the courage and there's just that motivation to come and try, see what's speaking here. It was like just seeing all of this array of podcasts like yours, the one that AP does, the new panel guest miniseries you've done with the writers, and all your podcasts and projects, audio projects. Those were motivating.
That's awesome to hear. And yeah, it's no secret, I think, that I've like shortly after I started, you were one of the first people I went to. I said, please be on it. You're like, oh, I'm not right now. And I kept bugging you. I kept begging you to be on it because we've been friends for a long time. We've talked for quite a while. Like I said, from getting me into D&D to really enthralling me with your stories over the years. I thought you'd be great to have on. And then when you won the contest, I said, I gotta have you on. You're the first ever winner. You're so big now. You're gonna be too big to be on my podcast soon. Please be
Oh
on
yeah,
it. And I'm
yeah.
so glad. I'm so glad you took. It is. I totally understand. It can be a little nerve wracking to take the step, but it's really amazing to have you on it, and it's so amazing whenever anyone wants to chat like this. And I'm really honored that you've listened to it and that you take the time to come and share so much about your writing. I'm sure for your fans and also others in the community who hear this, it'll be inspiring to learn more about you and when they go to write themselves. And I guess it's a question I forgot to ask earlier, but for writers, to sort of end us off, for writers joining the community for the first time who are aspiring, do you have any advice for them when it comes to writing stories?
I think I'll start with the basic generic advice that everyone gives. Just keep writing. And I know I just dismissed this, but no, it really is important. You gotta keep writing. Like it's it's just the way you like you get there. Where you get to the next step. And I know this might be pretentious, like from someone who has barely reached the 100 watcher mark or whatever number you want to use, page views. But it does help. You keep writing, you find mistakes, you improve, you keep writing. And even if the feedback is not good, if you can get feedback though, do so. It's harsh. I know from the contest personally when you get criticized and you get people telling you why you're wrong, or well, what more specifically, sorry, why your writing is wrong. You think of it as you are wrong, but I mean, unless they are being specifically targeting you, which I don't think is the case with anyone in this community, as well, at least
Yeah,
so far that I know,
yeah,
they're criticizing the work, and it helps you improve. If you do get feedback, listen to it. It's not always right. Sometimes you gotta make a call, but just listening to it, keep an open mind. That's a good advice. And the third one, just to give another more, I guess, interesting advice. Talk to people in the community. I know it can be hard, especially for me, to reach out, but people like you've been very helpful with learning this, being part of the community thing, and in general, you'll be surprised if you try talking to people. Sometimes they'll talk back, and you can get the help you need. That being advice, that being just talking to you or sharing stuff that can help you. Give it a try. You don't know what you might get up from talking to people in the community.
beautifully said, Shadow. What a great place to end us off on, I think. Really awesome stuff. I want to thank you again for taking this time to chat. Been so great to learn more about you and your work, and I'm very excited to see what you get up to in the future. I encourage everyone to go check out LF-Shadowmelder. Uh, Definitely go and watch them if you haven't and read all of their stories. Every single one is what I would recommend to you. And thank you again for being on. And thank you everyone for listening. As always, I hope you take care and stay safe and keep being awesome, everybody. Bye for now.